Okay, I'm recording, baby. I'm recording. Here we go. We are going to talk about the 14th Amendment and its impact on the civil rights movement. We are going to concentrate particularly on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and how the 14th Amendment moves from Brown v. Board through to the march on Montgomery from Selma. So let us begin. Well, you got to have 14 before you can have Brown. We have spent a lot of time on 14. You should be familiar, painfully familiar with 14. And so now what we got to do is we got to look at the application of 14. Brown v. Board, a 9-0 unanimous decision overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. You cannot have the civil rights movement until Plessy is overturned. The reason for this is that before Brown, and Brown is going to uphold, is going to strike down segregation in schools, in public schools. Until you have that ruling, you cannot have a civil rights movement because you have no underpinning law to support you. You have no federal government court support, which will be enforced by the executive branch to support you. You're left with segregation in southern state laws. So it's pivotal that Brown v. Board overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. And now you can move forward. It's going to take a while, you know that. I mean, even though the decision is 9-0, and it's important that the decision is 9-0 because it sends a message across the country that this isn't some flimsy Supreme Court decision. This is adamant, and time has come to end segregation in schools in the South. The Supreme Court rules that this will take place with all deliberate speed. Well, all deliberate speed is whenever the southern states get around to doing it. And they will slow walk the process. They will delay the process. They will not launch in and desegregate schools. They won't do it. It's going to take action on the ground to force Brown's hand. And that is exactly what happens in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the Montgomery City bus line because she is charged with breaking the segregation order on the city bus. Well, why this is important is that Brown's decision, called that segregation is illegal in public schools, is going to now migrate out and reach into all public sectors. Remember, the 14th Amendment protects you from the state government. Well, the state government is responsible for the city buses in Montgomery. Those buses are public institutions, so they must abide by public law. Public law, after Brown v. Board, says that segregation violates equal protection. So what you're doing is you're taking equal protection that has been admitted by the court in 1954, and now you're just moving it over and applying it to the city buses in Montgomery. And so what happens is Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat. She is arrested. She is taken off the bus. She is fingerprinted, and she is charged with breaking the city bus ordinance. This is a fight that the NAACP, an organization dedicated to the rights of colored people, is going to embrace inside of Montgomery. And they are going to go to court, and they're going to work their way through the courts for 380 days. They're going to wind this situation through the court. So they're going to take the past precedent of Brown v. Board. They're going to apply it to the Montgomery bus boycott. And they're going, or not the boycott, but the arrest of Rosa Parks and others on that violated the city bus ordinance, which was, by this time now, because of Brown, was illegal. And it's going to take about a year plus to get this through the courts to the Supreme Court in Browder versus Gale. Meanwhile, the movement will begin, because at this time, this is, you think about the intersection of people and places and times in the world. Martin Luther King Jr., 26-year-old minister, from Atlanta through Boston University, studying his PhD, working on his PhD, comes down to Montgomery, takes the position as minister of Dexter Church on the corner across from the state capitol. So he's this young guy, this young, vibrant guy is in town right when, he's been in there for about 6 months when Rosa Parks refuses the seat and gets arrested. So you've got this intersection of Parks and King, the NAACP, the bus boycott, and you have the past precedent of Brown, which has ruled in support of equal protection of 14. You got all of the ingredients to make this thing work. And maybe the most important part of the civil rights movement is the first part, is this bus boycott. Because it was all black. It was hugely poor, hugely poor. 80%, 70% of the bus ridership in Montgomery was black. And yet the layout of the bus was that the first 4 rows were whites only. The last 5 rows were blacks only. And then in the middle, you had this dilemma where it was black or white, but if one white person sat in a row either side of the bus, then the black people had to get up and move back. So there could be no intermingling in those rows. If white people wanted it, everything could be white except for the last 4 or 5 rows of the bus. And 70% of the ridership was black. And so what happened in the bus boycott is as Browder versus Gale is moving its way through the Supreme Court and using 14 to fight that battle, what is happening on the street is black people, at the urging and the support of Dr. King and the NAACP and the other ministers and churches all over Montgomery, were keeping people in step, keeping people nonviolent, keeping people off the buses. And they stayed off the buses. 380 days they stayed off the buses. So it's a pretty big time. A lot of them at the I don't know, they could have easily lost their job, could have been fired. And they stuck it out. They stuck it out, baby. And King said that the movement was over at that time, that in 56, when the boycott was moving forward, that it was done. It was just a matter of time, because he said, in Montgomery, you can't ride a man when his back is straight. And in Montgomery, we straightened our backs and we stood up tall. And so Montgomery is pivotal. It takes 14 and it uses 14 to end bus segregation. And then bus segregation begins to break down all over the South. The next one I'm going to talk about is 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. In Little Rock, Arkansas, you have implementation of 14, directly 14. So 14 is directly related to school desegregation. Little Rock, Arkansas, the Little Rock School Board says, okay, we're going to try this. We're going to do our best to adhere to the law, and we are going to bring these 9 kids into Little Rock High School in 1957. We're going to do this. And so they planned for this. They set about doing this. They moved forward to do this. And then the governor, Orville Faubus of Arkansas, seizing a political moment, knowing that white people will support him in mass, sends the National Guard out on the opening day of school and says, no, put it up. Nope, you're not coming. You're not coming into this school. You are not going to be here. In direct violation of the Supreme Court, in direct violation of the implementation of Brown v. Board. Dwight David Eisenhower is the President of the United States. He can't have a state government bring armed soldiers out in front of a school to deny entry and challenge the legitimacy of a Supreme Court decision. That's pretty close to treason. And so Eisenhower packs up the 101st Airborne and sends them down to Little Rock, escorts these kids to school, brings them into school. The executive branch exercises its authority to enforce Brown v. Board at Little Rock, Arkansas, and these 9 kids go to school for the year. And it's a tough year. I mean, what you have again here is you have the court working with the federal government and then pushing people on the ground. The key is people on the ground. If you don't have people on the ground, then things stay in the courts. And if things stay in the court, nothing gets changed. But in Montgomery, you had the whole city of Black people refusing to ride those buses and breaking the back of the bus lines. In Little Rock, you had the newspapers and the TV cameras, and you had these 9 courageous kids move into that school and go to school for the entire year. The state government has to bring back the National Guard to replace the 101st Airborne. The military goes back to Washington. The National Guard is federalized, and they take over the monitoring of the school for the year. The following year, they didn't even have a school in Little Rock. They shut it all down. They COVIDed it. In the 57 class, which graduated in 58, Ernest Green was the one graduate. Ernest Green, and Martin Luther King went to the graduation ceremony and sat quietly in the back, said nothing. Ernest Green graduated, went on to get a degree from Michigan State University. And so the Little Rock episode was vital at, again, taking 14 and pushing 14 onward, making 14 be enforced by the federal government, so that it became real. And so then you got school desegregating starting to happen around the South. So now, okay, you have 14 moving on its route. And the next thing you have to do is 14, remember, deals with state government. It deals with everything that deals with the state government. It doesn't deal with private entities. So it would deal with Oak Ridge High School, but it wouldn't deal with ENA. It would deal with the library, Eggleston Library, but it wouldn't enforce anything at Mr. Quick. All of the businesses down Apple Avenue, none of them would be limited in what they could do in regard to 14. And so what the civil rights movement had to do, and it's growing now, by 57, 58, 59, it's beginning to enlarge. It's reaching into colleges. Young people at Black colleges in the South are excited about it. King is gaining notoriety. He's certainly not the only voice, but he is still the leading voice. And you start to have different segments, different groups pop up, and all through nonviolence. I mean, this is the amazing thing about it, isn't it? How do you do this whole thing nonviolently? How do you turn the other cheek over and over and over again? God, that takes an enormous amount of courage and organization. And I think it's one thing that the Black Lives Matter movement lacks, you know. It doesn't have the discipline or the organization that the civil rights movement did that would keep its fringes in line. And you have to keep your fringes in line, because if you don't, then the violence of the fringes becomes the face of the movement. And even if your cause is noble, you still aren't gaining the support that you need from white America. And you need it from white America, because Black people in this country only constitute, what, 12% of the population. And so you need the rest of America stand up and take notice. Up to 59, 50, 57 with Little Rock and continuing up. It's still a regional movement down in the South. Things happen in 1960 is interesting, because what the movement's trying to do now is it's trying to take, think about this now, it's trying to take the 14th Amendment and cutting it and pasting it into the private sector. So now the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, we want to apply that to Mr. Quick. We want to apply the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause to E&A and to McDonald's and to all of the businesses on Apple Avenue. Because at that time, Jim Crow laws said, you know, okay, if you're Black, you go to the drive-up window. You walk up to the drive-up window, you can't come in to the restaurant. If you're in a restaurant, you can't be in this particular place in the restaurant. You come in the back door of the restaurant. You can't stay at certain hotels. You can't, I don't know, some places you can't even go into. Many places you can't even go into. If you're in a movie theater, come on, if you're in a movie theater, you have to sit in the balcony. White people at the bottom, Black people up in the balcony. Why? Because that is Jim Crow, separate but equal. That's how they got around the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And so Brown v. Board changes that in the public sector, but it doesn't change it in the private sector. In the private sector is our problem. And so what happens just naturally, it isn't even guided by King. King's not even a part of this. Young people at colleges in the South, young Black people, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, these guys who will end up, you'll see them in Selma, all of these guys, Julian Bond, a lot of them, they begin to take part in sit-ins. These were really cool. And what they're going to do is they will become SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They will be the young arm of the civil rights movement. And they will begin to push into the private sector. So they're going to go at businesses, and they're going to try to break the back of businesses to change their laws in the way they deal with Black people. This is not going to be protected under the, this is not protected under the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is public spaces. Public spaces are tax dollars. And so 4 guys in Greensboro, Tennessee, go downtown to the Woolworths and they sit in, first sit in. They just sit there. Black people couldn't sit at the counter, couldn't eat at the counter. They could buy stuff, but they couldn't eat at the counter. They sat in. They drank coffee. They studied. Nobody knew what to do besides them. And then the following days, people started flooding, all sorts of Black people, all sorts of Black youths, young people who were awake and knew what their rights were under the Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, under the Equal Protection Clause. Those people started flooding in and sitting in all over the South. White mobs came out and beat the hell out of them, and the cops let them, and it got ugly at times. But at the end of the day, they just overwhelmed these businesses. And the businesses, come on, a business is about green. It's not about Black, it's not about white. And so businesses had to capitulate, and they had to open up their counters, and the world didn't end. And so this victory in the sit-ins was pivotal because it showed that what you need to do is you need to cut and paste 14 and move 14 into the private sector. Just like you incorporated the Bill of Rights into the state governments, you now incorporate 14 into the private sector, and you make it illegal to keep somebody out of a business based on civil rights, based on the color of your skin. And so now you see, you go in the summer, you're down in Grand Haven or in Muskegon, and you see a sign that says, no shirt, no shoes, no service. It can't say no shirt, no shoes, no service, no black people. It can't say no shirt, no shoes, no service, no gay people. Can't do that. Can't do that because that is going to be legislation that will come about in 1964 because of the pressure and the pressure and the pressure of the civil rights movement to cut and paste 14 into the private sector. That is so pivotal. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 is going to be pivotal in making that happen. And the sit-ins were what I would think the sit-ins were one of the first elements that pushed that envelope and pushed it hard, pushed it really, 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 really hard. Other things happened. I mean, the freedom rides, the freedom rides were brutal, 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 brutal. And showed so much dedication by the people that were riding them to move the Civil Rights Bill to action. The events of Birmingham, the dogs and the hoses, in all of the violence on the children in Birmingham for marching and marching and marching, that woke America up. That woke people that woke white northern people up that were sitting at the dinner table not paying attention to what was going on in the South. And you're sitting there at the dinner table and you say, hey honey, pass me the lima beans, and you look on the TV and you say, what the hell is going on with those dogs down in Birmingham? What is that? Put the lima beans down. Let's take a look at what this is. That was important. I think that was the first time that white America really, really woke up in 1963. Plus, come on, think about it. The United States was involved in the Cold War. Russia didn't have human rights, but then the United States was trying to, talk human rights. And yet they've got all of these horrors going down in Birmingham. Dogs attacking children, firemen and hoses attacking children, police arresting children who were nonviolent, who were marching, nonviolent, and marching, nonviolent. And the free press was there. That's important. That is important. In fact, the whole First Amendment is important. Let's take a step back and talk about the significance of Amendment 1 in regards to this. Okay, what does Amendment 1 protect? It protects free expression. Number one, free expression. Always free speech, free speech. And this is free speech. You asserting yourself and marching is free speech. It protects religion. That the government can't keep you from worshiping as you choose. The government cannot force a single religion on you. And so the churches became the safe haven for the movement. So many of the leaders of the movement were ministers. Vivian, and, Orange, and Bevel, all of those guys, a lot of them, King, they were ministers. And so they used the church as a safe haven. They could do their assemblies in the church, and it couldn't be stopped at the church. They were safe in the church. Third was the free press. You had to have the press. If you didn't have the press, who would know that you were getting beat up? Nonviolence is only good if people know you're being violated. And so the press had to be there. And the press was there. They said the king brought with him the 3 M's. Motivation, that he inspired people. Money. Wherever he went, he had to raise money because they had to meet bail. Everyone was getting arrested. And so they needed the money for bail. And thirdly, media. The media was instrumental in all of this stuff. It was instrumental in everything that was brought to bear in the movement. And so it didn't matter where this was going on. If this was going on in Greensboro, if it was going on in Atlanta, or it was going on in Birmingham or Selma or Marion, all of these things needed media coverage. And don't get me wrong, King is instrumental in this movement. But holy cow, so much of it was totally out of his control. And was moving in different places all over the South. And so he had no control over SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The NAACP was out of his hands. CORE was not under his tutelage. Southern Christian Leadership Conference was, but there were all sorts of different groups moving simultaneously and at times together. And there are a couple times where they do bring all their forces together. One is 63 in the March on Washington. That is pivotal because the march, let's go back here and we're going to I'm sorry. So the final two civil liberties protected in the First Amendment are assembly and petition. Well, assembly allows you to peaceably assemble. It's peaceably. So it allows you to assemble to protest. And then petition allows you to put your name on documents and put them before your government and force your government to be accountable to you, the citizen. I mean, just like the Declaration of Independence. Come on. That was the petition that founded the United States of America. How can you not allow and support and protect the petition? And so the petition that brought the young people and the old people and all the groups together the first time is in 63 in the March on Washington, where King gave his I Had a Dream speech. What was the reason of that? The reason of that was to, if you've been in Washington and you've stood where he stood at the Lincoln Memorial, you look across the mall all the way down and there's the Washington Monument. And beyond the Washington Monument is the Capitol building. And they were petitioning and assembled. And they were petitioning the U.S. Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And what was the Civil Rights Bill? The cut and paste of 14 into the private sector. Voila. That was the goal. By now, you had started to get 14 was being enforced. Jim Crow was being defeated in the public sector. But you needed that civil rights bill in the private sector. So the March on Washington was highly successful. Lots of speakers. John Lewis spoke representing SNCC. King spoke representing SCLC. It was an accumulation of white people and black people and Jewish people and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, all sorts of different groups, peaceably assembly in Washington to call for a civil rights bill. Successful all over the world. In media, on TV, in the papers. The tide had turned by now. The tide had turned. King is now established as the leader of the movement. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. And so this large, this outpouring to the world for the Civil Rights Bill and the example of nonviolence in Washington was so overwhelming that I think that the flood was beginning. But then, 3 weeks after the March on Washington, the 4 little girls are killed by Klansmen, blown to bits back in Birmingham in the church. And then in November, Kennedy's assassinated. So all of this planet that's going down looks like it's tumbling. The Vietnam War is ramping up. We got problems. But you keep the pressure on. You keep on marching. You keep on marching. You keep on pushing through the courts. The NAACP keeps pushing through the courts. SNCC and CORE and SCLC keep pushing on the ground. You keep your movement nonviolent. You keep pushing, all the time pushing. But in your back pocket, you've got the 14th Amendment. Equal protection. Equal protection. In your quiver of arrows, you got the First Amendment. You got speech. You got religion. You got press. You got petition. You've got assembly. And you use the First Amendment, protected by the 14th Amendment, to push through the Civil Rights Bill in the summer of '64. And now you've got one goal left. And that is voting. So after the Civil Rights Bill is passed, now your goal is you are crystallizing 14. You're making 14 real. Now it's time to make 15. Because there was no Black voting in the South. None. Zero. Well, why? You look at 15, and 15 says you can't keep somebody from voting based on the previous servitude or color of their skin. You look at that, and by now women could vote. 1919. And so you look at that, and you say, why? How is that possible? That would violate the Constitution. Because what was going on all over the South is Southern white terrorism to keep people from voting, obviously, the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups. And in addition, you also had this registration thing. You couldn't register to vote. If you want to vote, you got to register first. That's the law. You can't just show up and vote. You got to register. Well, what happened all through the South is that Southern states, governments kept Black people from registering to vote. They asked them outlandish questions. They didn't allow them to come and register on certain days, one day a month. I interviewed people, I talked to people, how many bricks in the courthouse wall? Really? If you can't name it, then you can't register. If you can't register, you can't vote. So you're technically not breaking the 15th Amendment. You're just not providing registration possibilities. There were poll taxes. How many bubbles in a bar of soap? Talked to a guy who was asked that question. How many senators in the Alabama State Senate? Then you knew that? Well, fine. What are their names? What are their addresses? You can't register, so you can't vote. Black people couldn't register, they didn't vote. And so the final push is in Selma, Alabama, for voting rights, that we're going to end this charade of voting rights, of inability to register. So we've got the 14th now. The 14th is being enacted now. We've gone through Montgomery. Montgomery has pushed the 14th into the public sector. We pushed into Little Rock Central High School. We pushed. We've got the courts on our side. The federal courts are interpreting this amendment properly. We've taken 14, we've cut it and we've pasted it and we pushed it into the private sector. And the Civil Rights Bill is passed. And now businesses can't keep you out because you're Black. But we still got a voting problem. we still got a voting problem. And so all hands shift. It's like a war, you know. You got a big freaking map, and you move the troops into position. SNCC went, SCLC went, Foreman went, King went, Lewis went, Vivian went, Bevel went, Hosea Williams went. They all, James Orange, everybody was in Selma. In the winter, in the spring of 65. 4 people were killed. 4 people were killed in Selma. Marching. There's marches. It was just marches and marches and marches from the church, Brown Chapel, to the police, or to the courthouse for the right to vote. Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed up in Marion. I have done substantial amount of work with the Selma and Marion movement, and I'm going to give you my work that you can learn more about it. I think you'll like that. But briefly, the movement is all about voting rights. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old black man, is shot point blank in the stomach by an Alabama state trooper, unarmed, at a night march in a nearby town. James Reeb, a Unitarian minister from up in New Hampshire who came down to help in the movement, is beat to death by a bunch of racists coming out of a bar at night after turnaround Tuesday down in Selma. At the end of the march, in March of 65, Viola Liuzzo, who is a Detroit housewife, 43 years old, has 5 kids, who went down in her station wagon to help with the movement, is driving back from Montgomery with a young black guy in the back seat. A car pulls up and chases them at 100 miles an hour up the back highway and rolls down the window and leans over and shoots with a shotgun and blows Viola Liuzzo's head off. Nobody is ever prosecuted. Nobody's ever found guilty. White people never go to trial for any of these murders. But the movement continues on, and the pressure of nonviolent civil disobedience in the march, the 54-mile march, with all of the violence perpetrated on nonviolent civil rights activists down to Montgomery, is successful. Highly successful. Beautifully successful. So integrated. By now in 65, white people are emerged into the movement. Black people are enveloped into the movement. Famous people, poor people, all sorts of different individuals from all walks of life are in the movement on that 5-day, 4-night, 54-mile march down to Montgomery, and then in front of 25,000 people on the steps of the Montgomery State Capitol, where George Wallace had said before, segregation now, segregation today, segregation forever. On the steps of that Capitol, King gave his best speech ever. And in that speech, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. If you do the bending, if you have the underlying law that works its way through the courts and supports you, as the 14th Amendment finally did with Brown v. Board, if you have the courage to go on the ground and put your life on the line, as so many did, then you can bend the arc. You can bend the arc. And then you can prove that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it does bend towards justice. It can't bend towards justice without you pushing it, then it just stays out there. You got to bend it down. When you can't bend it down until you're aware that of your rights, of the law, You need to know the 14th Amendment. You need to know the Equal Protection Clause, the Due Process Clause. You need to know that the government can't take those God-given rights from you. Then you got to have the courage to step up and fight for it, for you and for anybody else who isn't getting those rights. That, my friends, is what it's all about. And that is what being awake is all about. There you go.